January the 12th, 1945, the date that marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. On this frozen winter morning, over 2 million soldiers of the Red Army surged westward across the snow-covered plains of Poland and into German territory. This was the Vistula-Oder Offensive, one of the most catastrophic military operations in modern history. The German Army Group A, already devastated and demoralized, faced a Soviet onslaught they simply could not withstand. Within days, the first Soviet troops set foot on German soil, the very heartland of the Third Reich that had tormented them for nearly 4 years. But what these Soviet soldiers encountered would shock them in ways that the Nazi propaganda they had endured could never have prepared them for. This encounter between the Red Army and German society would reveal one of the greatest historical paradoxes of World War II, a profound cultural and economic collision that has largely been forgotten by history. The Soviet breakthrough, the Vistula-Oder Offensive, was an overwhelming demonstration of Soviet military superiority. Marshal Georgy Zhukov and Marshal Ivan Konev commanded approximately 1.35 million soldiers, outnumbering the German defenders by nearly 5-1. Against this tide of red uniformed troops came the ragged remnants of the Wehrmacht, depleted divisions, hastily reformed units, and desperately thrown together defensive lines. The offensive opened with a catastrophic bombardment. Artillery guns thundered across the landscape in an intensity rarely seen even on the Eastern Front. The initial barrage at the Baranov bridgehead was so devastating that German divisions lost 2/3 of their artillery and 1/4 of their infantry in the opening hours. By January 14th, less than 48 hours into the operation, the Soviet mechanized columns were already racing westward at a pace that defied the frozen terrain and the dying gasps of German resistance. Within a month, Soviet advance guards had reached the Oder River, just 70 kilometers from Berlin itself. The Third Reich's eastern frontier had simply collapsed. In their wake, millions of German civilians began the most desperate flight in European history. Between 8 and 10 million ethnic Germans abandoned their homes, their possessions, their entire world, and fled westward through sub-zero temperatures that would claim hundreds of thousands of lives. But amid this military collapse and human catastrophe lay something unexpected. As Soviet soldiers pushed deeper into German territory, they began to encounter something that contradicted everything they had been told about the world they were fighting for. The discovery of contradiction. Most Soviet soldiers came from villages and collective farms where poverty was a way of life. The Soviet Union that Stalin had built was fundamentally an agrarian, rural society. Yes, there were Soviet cities and industrial centers, but the majority of Red Army soldiers, especially the front-line troops, came from backgrounds of profound scarcity. When these soldiers began to enter the German countryside and small towns, they encountered something that initially bewildered them. The houses they discovered were not humble peasant dwellings. These were brick and stone structures, many with well-maintained gardens filled with carefully trimmed hedges. They had solid construction, glass windows, and furnishings that spoke of comfort and stability. Pavements were in good condition. The roads, compared to the rutted mud tracks of Soviet territories, were engineered with care and precision. Soviet soldiers, conditioned by official Soviet propaganda to believe that they were fighting on behalf of the oppressed workers of the world against fascist exploitation, suddenly questioned the logic they had been taught. If Germany's capitalist system was so inferior to Soviet communism, why did ordinary German homes appear so vastly superior to the homes of Soviet workers and peasants? If the Nazis represented the height of bourgeois oppression, how could they have built a society with such material comfort? These soldiers were experiencing what might be called the greatest propaganda crisis of their lives: the piano paradox. Among the discoveries that most stunned Soviet soldiers were the pianos. In nearly every German home they entered, not just the estates of wealthy barons, but in the homes of ordinary middle-class Germans, they found pianos. For soldiers from a society where such instruments were museum pieces or the exclusive possessions of Communist Party elites, this was astonishing. The Soviets also found something equally surprising: radios. Not military radios or communication equipment, but consumer radios, broadcast receivers, civilian property designed solely for the purpose of entertainment and information. In the Soviet Union, such technology was carefully controlled, rationed, and limited to the most trustworthy citizens. Here, they appeared to be almost commonplace. Along with these discoveries came evidence of culinary abundance. Soviet soldiers found well-stocked pantries, orchards with apple trees, livestock, and preserves. They encountered evidence of agricultural organization that seemed to work for individual benefit rather than the collective. Families had possessed personal possessions, not just basic survival items, but cultural goods, decorative items, and evidence of what historians would call a consumer lifestyle. This created a psychological crisis among the Soviet troops. Many wrote letters home attempting to make sense of what they were seeing. One Soviet soldier left a testimony that captures the bewilderment perfectly. How are we going to treat these Germans? They do not lack anything. They are well fed. They have good houses and livestock. They have orchards with apple trees, and they come and invade us? They even reached my city more than 1,000 kilometers from here. For that alone, Captain, we should strangle them all. The logic was confused but revealing. These soldiers were trying to reconcile contradictory pieces of information. The Germans invaded Soviet territory and caused immense suffering, yet they lived in material conditions that seemed vastly superior to those of Soviet citizens. How could a society with such advantages need to invade anyone? What did this say about Soviet communism if its material basis was so inferior? The postal crisis. The Soviet High Command soon became aware of this crisis. Their intelligence operatives monitoring the postal censorship centers noticed something alarming. Soldiers were writing extensively to their families describing the material conditions of Germany. They were discussing the quality of German homes, the presence of consumer goods, the sophistication of German infrastructure. While these soldiers were not writing with disloyalty, the content was politically dangerous. The letters were flooding back to Soviet families who themselves lived in conditions of deprivation and scarcity. Imagine a factory worker's wife or a collective farm member receiving correspondence from the front that described German prosperity. This information could potentially undermine the ideological foundation that the Soviet state had carefully constructed. The political departments of the Red Army had to take action. They increased censorship of outgoing mail. They worked to intercept letters that mentioned these observations. They even took the unusual step of organizing the delivery of paper to soldiers in Germany, not as an act of generosity, but to prevent soldiers from using captured German postcards and letterhead that bore communist slogans or symbols. The fear was that if soldiers used German paper to write their letters, it would be seen as contamination of the Soviet message. This paper supply effort was one of the more absurd consequences of the Soviet state's need to maintain ideological purity in the face of observable reality. But it reveals the desperation with which Soviet authorities worked to prevent the truth about German prosperity from reaching Soviet citizens. The destruction as concealment here is where the destruction itself takes on new meaning. Soviet soldiers systematically burned and demolished German homes, not just in warfare, but as a deliberate policy. They destroyed furniture, smashed household goods, and torched buildings that could have sheltered them during the brutal winter. British journalist Alexander Verth observed Soviet soldiers burning down the nearly intact town of Allenstein, bewildering the Polish population who questioned why the Soviets would destroy perfectly usable structures. The official explanation was that this prevented German resistance and prevented Soviet rearguard troops from looting. But there was likely a secondary purpose: destruction as erasure. If German homes and possessions were eliminated, if the evidence of German prosperity was burned away, then the contradiction could not be sustained. The material evidence of a capitalist society that seemed superior in fundamental ways to Soviet communism would be eliminated. What we witness in January and February of 1945 is not simply the vengeance of soldiers who had suffered Nazi atrocities, though that was certainly part of it. We also see a desperate attempt by the Soviet system to prevent its own contradiction from becoming visible to Soviet soldiers, and through them to Soviet citizens. The complexity of contradiction and vengeance. The destruction was motivated by multiple factors existing simultaneously. Soviet soldiers had legitimate grievances, approximately 14. 6 million Soviet civilians had been killed by German invasion and occupation. The Soviet Union had suffered the destruction of 32,000 factories and the loss of approximately 30% of its national wealth. Soviet soldiers had witnessed burned villages, mass graves, starved populations, and atrocities beyond comprehension. When these traumatized soldiers encountered German prosperity, the psychological reaction was complex. Soviet propagandists, particularly the writer Ilya Ehrenburg, had deliberately incited vengeance. Ehrenberg's wartime writings declared, "The Germans are not human beings. Kill the German. That is your grandmother's request. Kill the German. That is your child's prayer." The Soviet state had weaponized rage as a military strategy, and now that weaponized rage had met German material reality. The result was destruction that served multiple psychological and political purposes simultaneously. Punishment, erasure of contradiction, prevention of ideological corruption, and the channeling of legitimate vengeance. Soviet prisoners, the tragedy within. But there was another tragedy unfolding within this chaos. Soviet prisoners of war, forced laborers, and Soviet citizens who had collaborated with the Germans were being liberated by the advancing Red Army. These numbered in the millions men and women who had spent years in German captivity or in German-occupied territories. The Soviet state treated these survivors with profound suspicion. They were accused of treason, collaboration, and desertion. Many faced court-martial. The irony was bitter. These individuals had experienced German cruelty firsthand, yet now they were punished by their own state for their suffering. Some were executed, others were sent to Soviet labor camps. Soviet women who had been held captive were subjected to treatment by their own countrymen that rivaled German brutality. The Soviet system could not tolerate the existence of citizens who had lived through the war outside Soviet control. These survivors were potential vectors for Western contamination knowledge of how life in other places compared to the Soviet Union. The German crisis. From the German perspective, the military situation was catastrophic. The news that the Soviets had breached the Vistula-Oder line and were advancing across Polish territory at rates of tens of kilometers per day could not be hidden from the German population. Refugees began arriving with testimonies of Soviet atrocities, destruction, and violence. Nazi propaganda, which had demonized the Soviet threat for years, now found its purposes fulfilled. The German population understood that surrender meant capture by an enemy whose intentions toward them were merciless. The regime that had ordered not one step back on the Eastern Front now issued similar orders to German troops: fight or face Soviet conquest. Conclusion: a paradox. Buried what we observe in the winter of 1945 is a moment when historical forces collided with observable reality. Soviet soldiers encountered evidence that contradicted the fundamental ideological claims of the system they were fighting for. A capitalist, fascist society had built material prosperity that exceeded what a communist workers' state had achieved. This contradiction could not be sustained within Soviet ideology. The response was to destroy the evidence and punish those who had witnessed it. The prosperity was burned away. The soldiers' letters were censored. The survivors were interrogated and imprisoned. The paradox was buried beneath layers of propaganda, denial, and deliberate forgetting. Yet the historical record remains. In letters, in testimonies, in archival records, we can still read the bewilderment of Soviet soldiers encountering a reality that their education and propaganda had not prepared them for. We can witness a moment when the collision between ideology and reality was so profound that even the machinery of Soviet control could not completely suppress it. The Vistula-Oder Offensive was indeed one of the greatest military achievements of the war. It brought Soviet power to the gates of Berlin and ensured Soviet dominance of Eastern Europe. But for those who study this period carefully, it also reveals something else. A moment when thousands of Soviet citizens encountered a contradiction so fundamental that their government had to work desperately to conceal it. This is the real shock that Soviet soldiers experienced when they entered Germany in 1945. Not merely the presence of material prosperity, but the revelation that the system they were fighting for was failing to deliver what its propaganda claimed had already been achieved. And that truth, more dangerous than any weapon, had to be eliminated as thoroughly as the German homes themselves.